Bonjour et bienvenue dans le podcast Parole d'Histoire, une émission consacrée à l'actualité des livres, des débats et de la recherche en histoire, créée et animée par André Loez. Aujourd'hui, un entretien un peu inhabituel puisqu'il est entièrement en anglais. J'ai eu la chance de discuter avec une historienne britannique de l'Antiquité, Josephine Quinn, pour sa grande fresque « Et le monde, créa l'Occident », traduit cette année aux éditions du Seuil. Et plus largement, on a parlé de son parcours, en passant par son directeur de thèse, le grand Erich Gruen, son rapport à l'archéologie, la question très débattue des sacrifices humains à Carthage. J'espère que l'émission vous plaira. Pour les personnes qui ne sont pas anglophones, je pense qu'il est possible d'avoir des sous-titres dans la version YouTube du podcast. Merci et très bonne écoute.
Hello, Josephine Quinn.
Hello.
You've just published in French Et le monde, créa l'Occident, which is a translation of how the West was made. A huge, sprawling book which starts in the Bronze Age, even a little bit before, and then leads to the end of the Middle Ages and tries to reshape the way that we think about ancient history and ancient societies with a basic premise, a basic argument is that a conventional narrative centered on Greece, Rome, and the West needs to be deepened, complexified by taking into account many more peoples and interactions between peoples. Before we talk about the book, I would like to ask you about your background as an ancient historian. How did you come to ancient history and what kind of training did you have?
I came to classics in the first place by a rather unusual route in that I was studying at a state school in the Midlands in England and not the kind of school that people went to study classics from, ancient Greeks and Romans. But I loved languages, and so I managed to find a school that I could do some Latin at. Friends of my parents helped me with Latin and Greek and so on. And I basically taught myself quite a lot. And so I was able to go to Oxford to study classics there. And at first, I thought I would just concentrate on languages. That was really my great passion. But then we were forced to take some other taster courses.
Yeah, sometimes it's good to be forced.
Exactly. Within 10 minutes of starting to learn ancient history, I knew this was what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And I just loved reading the original sources with questions about the real world in mind.
Did you have a preference between Rome and Greece as a starting point? Because, of course, we'll see that it became more complex and the Phoenicians came into the picture.
Yes, that was all later.
But at first?
At the beginning, I actually, did a traditional thing. We started with Greece and then we did Rome. But what we did when we started looking at Rome was the Hellenistic world and basically Greek ideas about the Romans. And that was what really interested me. And it sort of interested me ever since, this kind of gap in between Greek history and Roman history when these two sets of people, these two traditions meet each other for the first time. And we actually have a lot that gets written down about what they think of each other and so on. And in particular, what Greeks think about this very sudden rise of the Roman Empire from almost nothing. And that fascinated me, and that continues to fascinate me today.
I saw that your dissertation was supervised by a great Hellenistic historian. Not only he started with Rome, but he became a real reference and authority on the Hellenistic world, which is Erich Gruen. Can you talk a little bit of working with him? Because I don't think he's translated in French, and he's not maybe well known for many people who listen to this podcast.
Oh, well, he is just an extraordinary scholar, but even more importantly, an extraordinary man. So this is a guy who he's just turned 90. In fact, he started off as a Roman historian, very traditional Roman political history. His first big book was about the last generation of the Roman Republic and why everyone thought about it was wrong. Then he went
contradicting Ronald Syme,
exactly,
which was the Roman Revolution, which was a very landmark interpretation.
Yes.
And he said, well, hold on, there's more to it.
Yeah, and really one of the things that he's wonderful at is normalising history, is saying we shouldn't think that everything that we know from the past is evidence for some enormous change or movement or something, that most people most of the time are just getting on with it. Things don't seem as extreme as they might do in retrospect, which is very interesting at the moment for thinking about American history, I think. But he moved on from this very kind of a traditional but very sort of in a way revolutionary approach to Roman history. And then he started working on Hellenistic history and the rise of the Roman Empire, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean. And then he made another huge change into Jewish history. And then, you know, after he retired, around about the time he was retiring, he sort of moved again into cultural history and looking at ethnicity and that kind of thing. And so, I mean, he was an incredible, incredible supervisor. He was very, very demanding. He absolutely held nothing back. He was extremely critical in a very good way. He never sugarcoated it. And I think that's one, if I'm a good historian, it's because I was held to a very high standard as a graduate student. But he also was a really good role model for having a broad-minded approach to history, of not being bound by what people consider to be ancient history, or once you've started in a speciality, you should stay there. He really just encouraged us all the time to be open to the next interesting set of ideas. He also, I should say, used to get up extremely early in the morning. And I think this was useful for students too. I mean, he really, I don't know.
So you would get emails at 5:30?
Exactly. But we would also, we'd ask to meet him, and we could maybe arrange a meeting for 6 a.m. in one of the cafes in Berkeley. And he knew, and of course he kept in touch with his students, so we'd see him all over the world. In any city in the world, he could tell you when all the coffee shops opened. He always knew. And that was actually a very good lesson as well when you're a student, to realise that, you know, to have a very successful career can in fact involve getting up early in the morning and working hard.
You mentioned that your first approach was through language and therefore published texts mostly. Archaeology is absolutely prominent in your latest book. When did it start to become as central as it is now for you?
So that would be when I went to graduate school. So I did my undergraduate work at Oxford, and it was very much text-based. I found out much later that I could in fact have studied archaeology as an undergraduate, but my tutors at Oxford didn't mention that awkward fact to me. So, which I kind of am grateful for, because I loved immersing myself in the text. But I also knew there was this missing bit of the puzzle, and that I really needed to know more about archaeology, to do some archaeology. So I deliberately chose to do my graduate work at Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, where they have a program in ancient history and classical Mediterranean archaeology. In fact, ancient history and Mediterranean archaeology. And that was incredibly useful. So from the first summer that I was there, I was digging, and you just realise, I think if you don't actually practice archaeology, it's hard to understand how provisional the conclusions archaeologists reach are, how, you know, so much depends on detecting a soil change in soil that hasn't been touched for thousands of years. And that is a minimal change in colour that one person will look at one time of day and say, yes, that's a different layer. Another person will look at 2 hours later and say, nope, I can't see any difference there. And that's what it often rests on. Or survey archaeology, which is where people walk across fields picking up all the pottery they find. Extremely effective way of finding sites, quick and dirty dating, that kind of thing. But you realise when you actually do it, some people, a lot of it's done by students, of course, about half of them have the eye for it and half of them don't. And it just depends often. Did the student who had the eye for it walk over that bit of ground? If they did, they'll have seen it. If they didn't, they won't have done. Different people could see say, Roman pottery from the people who could see flints in the ground. Some people were very good at telling the difference between modern and ancient pottery. Other people weren't. And that was so interesting to me that I think if I hadn't actually done a lot then for decades, did a lot of archaeology, ending up co-directing a dig in North Africa. If I hadn't had that personal experience, I think I would have had a much less critical approach to archaeological publications. And I think that's been extremely useful to me as a historian.
To what extent did it shape your relationship to these massive cultural entities that are Greece and Rome, and that are so massive because of the many texts? Not all of them, of course, but a large portion of text has survived to us. And in regards to that, in your book, you put forward a lot of other peoples and a lot of other places that don't have written records. So how was archaeology significant for you in maybe becoming conscious that the fact that Greece and Rome have such a massive cultural imprint hides from history those who didn't write as much or whose writing haven't been conserved as much?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That's very interesting. I had never thought of that, but I'm sure that's right, in fact, that I never really questioned the sort of division of the ancient world into Greece and Rome when I was an undergraduate, and I was more interested in sort of a relationship between them. But once I started digging, it's partly that you see that there are so many places where something else is going on that yes, hasn't survived into the written documentation. But it's also that you just realise that there's more than one thing going on in a lot of places. I mean, digging is stratigraphic. You start in one period down through others. And places change over time and different people come and go and so on. And you can't actually, I think, be involved in an excavation in any kind of complex site and come out of it believing that the world can be quite easily divided up into different cultures. And I suppose that's right. That it was probably on archaeological sites that I first formulated this problem that really drives this recent book, which is, by the way, dedicated to Erich Gruen. The really kind of driving problem is what I call civilizational thinking, which is this idea that the world, that every piece of culture and society, that every person in the world, in the past and today, can be put into a separate box with a civilizational label on it. And yeah, once you actually start digging up the day-to-day lives of people, you realise, I suppose it's really an example of one of the kind of conclusions I came to in the book, which is that it isn't peoples that make history, it's people. And when you're digging up someone's house, you really see that.
It's funny because for a long time, some archaeologists, I mean, in the early 20th century, someone like Gustav Kosina, who was very influential in Germany, used archaeology to show that basically the Germans were everywhere and that the German people used to rule the whole of the north of the Black Sea and most of Europe. And he was caricatured as saying, ein Topf, ein Volk, one pot, one people. Yes. And that archaeology used to be also a way, and also the discipline has changed, used to be a way of proving that there was a hegemony of this or that culture, the culture of striped pottery or the culture of Germanic peoples. It's a very different archaeology that you practice today. Very
much so, yes. I think the real maxim that we go by now is pots aren't people. And, if you go to any of to your house, to my house, to the house of anyone listening, you'll see the stuff we have is not going to come from one thing. It's not made in one place. It's not going to come from one culture. And that's no different in the past either. So we look at it very differently, but of course things move on. And now the big and fascinating challenge to ancient historians like myself comes from the study of ancient genetics, of ancient DNA. And there, you really are. DNA is people. You don't get more people than that. But then you have to ask, well, what does it mean when we find out that, somebody is somebody's aunt or mother or something, or that another person has heritage from a completely different part of the world, or you study the isotopes in teeth and find out that somebody has moved a very long distance, perhaps to get married. We can talk about those sort of facts, but then it opens up this wonderful set of questions about what does that actually mean to people? And it's in a way similar to the problem of you can look at a pot and say, OK, this is made in one place from a particular tradition. But what does it actually mean to the people who own that pot or even who make it? And now we've got those same questions again with this very new type of evidence. And that, to me, that's one of the really fun reasons to stick at this job is that every 10 or 15 years a completely new challenge comes along like that, something to make sense of.
On this very specific topic of DNA, ancient DNA, and the way that it reshapes historical thinking, isn't there also a risk when you think about the political uses or implications? Because one of the arguments in your book is that it doesn't make sense to have a picture of the ancient past as a sort of white European, white marble European past when things were very much different and people were mixed and interactions took place all the time. But now if we have the ability to calculate that this skeleton is 94% from this origin, isn't there a risk of people trying to use this kind of evidence to sort of promote identity politics based on DNA?
There's a huge risk of it. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's really important that people like me get involved in this area, understand it. It is not straightforward. Well, I mean, pottery is not so straightforward, but neither is DNA, neither is the science of DNA. No, it's hugely important and interesting because you can read things so differently. So one of the things that I think is very exciting that has come out, big picture things that has come out from the detailed ancient DNA studies of the last 15 years or so is just how much people moved around in antiquity. The level of migration, I think, is something that I would never have predicted even 20 years ago. I think a lot of us believed, experimented, let's say, with the idea that that people adopted cultural fashions and so on more by contact than by actual movement and travel. And now it's clear that there's actually far more movement and travel going on than any of us, I think, even those of us who were very much on that end of the historical spectrum would have predicted. But then you have this problem of how do you actually interpret that? That to me, that's a sign of the extraordinary mixture and migration, the value of migration in the ancient world, that things change because new people come in. Another approach to that is to ring fence a certain set of scientific characteristics of the DNA and say, oh, well, that is a particularly Western or white heritage, or even, a British heritage, or I guess it would be a French heritage, something like that. And there's no particular justification for retrojecting modern concepts from British to white to Western, anything like that, back into the past, back into the deep past, because we just don't know how people thought about themselves. But as you say, the real danger is the assumption that identity is something that is transhistorical, whereas in fact the current focus, polite word for it, focus on identity is something I think is very hard to show existed in antiquity. There's a very nice argument. Charles Taylor, many years ago, decades ago, made the argument that the first time in ancient Greco-Roman texts that you really see a sense of interior being is in the work of St. Augustine. Now, you can argue slightly differently from that, but it's a very plausible case that nobody before the 5th century CE actually really thought in terms of identity at all. So then what do you do with the politics of that? On the one hand, it has nothing to do with the way people thought about themselves. Then there's this whole wonderful thing that one of the political, I would say, misuses of the DNA data is to look for origins of white Europeans far, far to the east. And so that's the origin of Europeans, say Caucasians, whatever it might be. It's in people coming from the steppe. There certainly is a lot of migration from the steppe. But to me, to conclude from people migrating thousands and thousands of miles from east to west, not all individually necessarily going that far, but over a period of a generation or two perhaps, moving great distances. The idea that that is an argument for my civilizational thinking, that for a kind of unbounded notion of identity, seems absurd. This is evidence that people in the past were not bounded by notions that some people belong in one place, other people belong in another place. So for me, it's a very exciting evidence base for a world of migration, mixture, and for the benefits that can bring.
And your previous book that was translated in French was Searching for the Phoenicians. Your work has looked into Carthage. How did this come about? When did you become interested in Carthage? You were always, I imagine, more or less interested in the Punic Wars, and as a classicist, you of course encounter Carthage. But when did it become a focus of your own work?
So in the year, I can pinpoint it to a particular week. I had been digging in Sicily with a team from Stanford, and we were digging at a wonderful site called Monte Polizzo. It was the first year. It's always very exciting when you're the first people onto an archaeological site. But it was brilliant, very intense. But a month just totally surrounded by other people, sleeping in a room of maybe 20 people. It's very, archaeology is very much a group sport. And when we finished, I just wanted to be on my own. And so I went, this is before the internet, and I went to the local travel agent in this town, Salemi, where we were, and I said, I want to just get on the plane. Where's the next flight from Palermo Airport? And they looked at their list. They said, well, there's a flight to Tunis in 3 hours. We could get you onto that. I said, fine, I'll go to Tunis. And so I got the bus to Palermo Airport. And it literally, I'd never been to North Africa before. I'd been to Morocco as a small child, but I'd never been to sort of ancient, the places of the Punic Wars, Carthage, that kind of stuff. And I got there and just fell in love with I fell in love with Tunis, with Tunisia. I started travelling around, the buses, the shared taxis and so on. I went to Carthage and was amazed by, Carthage, the site is a set of very, very small archaeological excavations in a very large site, which is now a suburb of modern Tunis, kind of seaside suburb of Tunis. And about 15 different national teams were invited there in the around 1980s for a UNESCO campaign. And they all did one project. And so it's like an amusement park. It's like Disneyland or something. You go from, one little museum and excavation, and 5 minutes away there's another one. So I absolutely loved that. I was fascinated by it. But then I started travelling around in the countryside and so on, going to look at the sites further away. And I really knew very little about North Africa beyond, the Punic Wars. And I had heard a lot, though, about Roman North Africa. And after a few days travelling around to all these sites, I realised I hadn't seen anything Roman at all. I'd seen a lot of very unusual and interesting stuff. I'd seen a lot of things that were clearly to do with Carthage. I'd seen a lot of things that were to do with the local Numidian kingdoms, which I didn't really know anything about at the time. And I'd seen a lot of kind of improvisations on Roman ideas and architecture and so on. But nothing I could have pointed to and said, as a Roman historian, this really even makes sense to me. So I became completely fascinated by North Africa as a whole. I wrote my doctoral dissertation in the end on exactly this problem of what's Roman about Roman Africa, essentially. What happened before, what's going on when the Romans conquer Africa archaeologically.
Which is very much, we should say, a reversal of a common way of thinking, if I'm thinking of the French scholars who worked on this subject, because Tunisia used to be a French colony. And so the discourse of French historiography up until the 60s, even later, was the Romanization of Africa was a foreground to our own colonial endeavors. And so the Romans built roads, we're building roads. The Romans built wells, we're building wells. scrolls, there was this notion that Africa was completely transformed by the Romans. So in a sense, you sort of participated in the inversion of that movement.
Absolutely. And it's the same in Libya with Mussolini really foregrounding Roman activities in Libya. But then also there was a big backlash, of course, in North Africa, particularly in Tunisia and Algeria, and a real valorization of the local kingdoms that preceded Roman power, coincided with it to some degree. To an extent that in itself became unhistorical, that was being studied to the... and in a funny way, the people who got left out entirely, I began to realise, were the Carthaginians, who were this sort of earlier probably colonial, certainly migrant force, certainly became an imperial force in North Africa and much of the Western Mediterranean. But they didn't really fit very comfortably into any of the political stories.
Yeah, they weren't resistors to the Romans.
Right.
They were there before the Romans.
Exactly.
So they couldn't be framed as anti-colonial freedom fighters.
Exactly. And they weren't exactly natives. And so I kind of came through North Africa to thinking about Carthage, and that took me back to the Phoenician homeland, and that was what led me on to thinking about Phoenicians more generally. But I feel like every step in my academic career has been just through noticing something that doesn't make sense in what I'm studying at the time, and that opens up this door into a whole new world.
It's also interesting because in studying different societies from the Greco-Roman sort of main focus, you encounter societies that aren't always pleasant. If I take the example of Carthage, you're one of the leading historians of Carthage, and you co-wrote a paper called Phoenician Bones of Contention, which is extremely interesting because it shows some light on a very troubling phenomenon, which was for very long discussed, and most people didn't think that it existed, which was human ritual sacrifice of children in burial sites in ancient Carthage and other Punic sites. Can you maybe tell us why this interested you and what kind of evidence you can use to say, well, the Carthaginians are interesting, but they're also interesting in spite of, we should say, the fact that they probably killed some of their own children?
Yes. I mean, there's a sort of two questions, aren't there? There's the sort of did they do it question, are they guilty? And then, what do we do with that if they did? And for me, I mean, honestly, we never know anything for sure about the ancient world, which is good because if we did, I'd be out of a job. But it does seem to me that the evidence is on the currently, at least, the evidence that we have does quite strongly suggest that some form of ritual killing of infants, religiously inflected killing of very small infants was a very common occurrence at Carthage. And I mean, what we have are references to this practice in other, because we have no literature, no history left from the Carthaginians themselves, probably because it simply hasn't survived. We've got references in Greek and Roman authors.
Which a lot of people have dismissed, saying, well, it's the colonial gaze of Greeks and Romans, so it must not be true. But it's a little bit more complex.
It is, because the problem is that by the time most of these sources are written, Carthage has been destroyed for centuries. And the very few Greeks and Romans observers who talk about it while Carthage is still in operation, before it's destroyed by the Romans in 146 BCE, are actually not very judgmental about it. They see it as they sort of present it as an unusual thing more than something really terrible, which is kind of strange in itself. That's one of the things that intrigued me. Knowing
that Romans used to bury alive some Gauls on the Forum as well. So
exactly.
It's not that rare of an occurrence.
Right. So the Romans themselves, particularly in this period, human ritual killing of various ways. Sacrifice to me is a difficult term in a lot of languages, especially English and French. It has all sorts of connotations, of sort of modern Christian connotations that don't really apply. So I'll talk about ritual, kind of religious killing. Basically, in order to please the gods. So you've got some of these external observers saying this happened. OK, that could go either way. You've then got 11 now, 10, 11 actual sites, cemeteries, infant cemeteries, where hundreds, sometimes thousands, sometimes many thousands at Carthage itself, of very young children are buried in urns, sometimes with the bones of animals. The only reason animals are buried in urns is if they are given as offerings to the gods. So it's very strange to have the two things mixed up. So that's odd, and that seems to fit in with the literary evidence. But again, in itself, it's certainly not a certain case.
A counter-argument could be these were children who were stillborn, and they were offered, and maybe we thank the gods because they could give them good passage to the afterlife.
Right, but and a lot of people have really tried that. Couple of problems with it. One is that ancient gods really don't like damaged goods, right? And it's a horrible way to describe it, but there are many religions, ancient religions, that we do have records for. You cannot offer a disabled child, a child who dies, and that's not even a child, I mean, a baby goat or a baby sheep or something. It's not all about human offerings.
And if you offer them and that the organs aren't in the right place, the sacrifice will not be validated.
Exactly. No, I mean, it's very common in ancient religion, that ancient Mediterranean religion at least, that the sacrifice or the offering should be perfect. And so that's a difficulty. And there's also the difficulty that when the bones are measured. These children are cremated, but ancient cremation is not very effective. So actually are quite a lot of bones left over. When they're measured and when you take into account that burning shrinks these bones, they are, almost all of them would date on sort of normal size scales to the first few weeks of life. Very few are so small that they would be, say, born dead already, although they might well die early in childhood. And very few of them are more than about 6 or 8 weeks. There are some outliers, but they're very young. And that is a very strange infant death pattern. Normally, you would expect a sort of gradual drop-off over the first year in a place without access to, modern medicine and so on. And then basically, if you make it through the first year, you're probably going to be okay. Whereas this is a really high percentage of the children are dying extremely young. So this is all a bit odd. The really clinching thing for me so far, as I say provisionally, is that there are inscriptions that go with these burials. And the inscriptions are quite clear that these they never name the what's been buried, but these are things, offerings, things that are offered because the God heard my voice. That's the formula that's used for 95% of cases. And what that means in every other context is because they answered my prayer. I asked for something, I offered something in return, absolutely standard deal in ancient religion. It'd be too rude just to ask a god for something without offering them something back. That's people offering their firstborn, that kind of thing. Even just the harvest festival kind of offerings of the first fruits. If your request is answered, whether that request is for, you could imagine it could be about crops. It could well be about sea voyages, very dangerous, very common. When we hear about specific reasons for this ritual killing in Carthage, again, from the outside, but it's when the city is under attack from outside forces. So they're kind of Thanksgiving gifts. And so for me, that formulation is the clinching evidence that this is the second half of a deal. here. And that seems horrific. It seems horrific to me. I'm glad it seems horrific to you too. But when you put it in context, it's not just that Romans are burying Gauls alive in the Forum, and from time to time Vestal virgins and so on. It's that unwanted children in Greek and Roman society were often simply left by the roadside. I mean, the polite term is exposed. But
as if a nymph or a kindly goat would do to them what they did to Zeus or Romulus. But in fact,
of course, usually they die if they are picked up.
There's a mythic consolation. The stories they told could consolate them.
But unfortunately, if those children were picked up, it was for a life of slavery. And that sort of explains to me why the contemporary sources aren't actually that horrified by it, because it's not that uncommon.
If we take this example to go back to the book that you recently published that was translated in French, it's also a way for you to use Carthage as a mirror of Rome and say that in spite of these quite massive differences, because the Romans, even if they don't always judge, they still remark that this is something that is a bit strange for them, for their taste. And yet you say that these two cities were closer together than we usually think. You even go so far as to say that they're a bit like Oxford and Cambridge.
Yes, which now, since I've moved from Oxford to Cambridge since I wrote that, and I think Oxford and Cambridge are more different than Carthage and Rome. No, I mean, one of the things I was really interested in writing this book was Rome's first first imperial ventures are to take over places that have been part of the Carthaginian Empire, Sicily, Sardinia, eventually Carthage itself. That all comes before the Romans are conquering large parts of Greece, the Levant, and so on, the kind of image of the Roman Empire. The earliest Roman provinces are taken over directly from Carthaginian provinces. And I got really interested over the last decade or so in just how much the Romans are actually taking from Carthage along with literally the land. And a lot of it is just very practical. Different kinds of taxation are taken directly over. That makes sense. Ways of dividing up the land, ways of bordering it and so on are taken over. And then I became interested in how, if you go even further back than that, early Roman treaties, even the way that the early Roman government is set up. We know a lot less about early Rome than we do about a lot of other places in the Mediterranean, 6th, 5th century. But what we do know mirrors Carthage. Two consuls, like the two suffetes at Carthage. The early Roman laws look much more like laws that we know about from the Levant, from Phoenician contexts, from Hebrew contexts and so on, in earlier West Asian contexts, than they do anything we know about in Greece or later Roman laws. And so there's just an awful lot of hints. Nothing absolutely one single thing you can put your finger on, but an awful lot of hints that Rome, looking across at Carthage, a much bigger, much more powerful, richer, successful place for 400 years while Rome is kind of growing. And, it makes a lot of sense that they borrow not only their way of doing empire, but also their just way of doing a city, their way of doing governance and so on, comes from Carthage. And that to me is fascinating, because so many modern historical ideas have gone back to Rome. The American Constitution, based on ideas about Rome. But what lies behind that? What's this really going back to?
This illustrates a more general pattern of the book, which is the refusal of civilizational divides, of saying that we shouldn't set aside Rome and Carthage as two distinct entities, but more as interrelated mirror images of each other. And throughout the book, you try to weave these different stories and places together. I wonder if there wasn't a counter-argument in the ancient sources, because during if we take Herodotus or Augustine, these are people who also constructed their own visions of the East and the West, or of Europe and Asia, of civilization and barbarism. So isn't it going too far to sort of getting rid of the civilizational divide when actors in the past themselves framed their own conceptions in part in these divides?
I love that question. Thank you. Okay, so let's take Augustine and Herodotus. Let's take Augustine first, because Augustine's actually the first person to talk in terms of East and West, Occidens and Oriens. And when he talks about it, it's just one way of dividing the world up. You know, you can divide it up by continents, or you can divide these continents into East and West, or you can do a number of things. He's just sort of going through kind of intellectually different ways you could divide the world up in a context where what he's really interested in is not the human world at all, but the city of God. It comes from his book, The City of God, and his last great work, and which is, you know, it's about getting beyond those sort of divides. So he produces this very kind of nice, easy distinction between East and West. But for him, that doesn't have a kind of important theological symbolism or sort of historical symbolism. Now, I think actually it does come out of historical experience for him because, of course, he really lives through the, what should we call it? Not the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but the sort of fizzling out, the disappearance, the vaporization of Roman power in the West. I mean, literally, as he's dying, the Vandals are taking his city of Hippo. And so I think that that is probably coming out. I mean, I'm psychologizing him here, but I think it probably is coming out of living a long life where over the course of that lifetime, the Western part of your world has basically disappeared. The kind of coherence of it has disappeared and everything's about the East. I think that probably suggests that divide to him. But it isn't something that he's making civilizational or cultural. He's just talking about geography at this point. Then if we go right back, you know, almost 1,000 years to Herodotus, this is a really interesting question. Herodotus talks a lot about culture. I think he and I would have really got on. We'd have a lot to talk about.
He's usually described as the father of history. He's more the father of anthropology.
Right, exactly.
Ethnography.
And he's very interested in how different people do things differently and so on. He's not judgmental. It's a fascinating approach to human science. But what he does is that he talks about the ways that people divide the world up. So for him, he doesn't talk in terms of East and West. He does sometimes talk in terms of Asia and Europe. But the thing that he really draws attention to is that is a divide that is important to the Persians. And is not particularly important to the Greeks. In fact, the Greeks almost very, very rarely talk about Asia and Europe. And that makes sense because there are lots of Greek-speaking communities in Asia, particularly in Asia Minor, modern Turkey. So for the Greeks, it's sort of politically not useful to have either an East-West or an Asia-Europe divide being very prominent. But Herodotus, who himself is in this fascinating position of growing up under the Roman Empire in Western Turkey, under the Persian Empire in Western Turkey, but writing in Greek, writing, as far as we know, for a largely Greek audience. And so he's a lot of the time explaining Persian ways of thinking about things. And particularly when he's talking about Asia and Europe, the ways that there are these groups of sailors keep stealing each other's women and so on, Asians and like Trojans and so on, Phoenicians stealing women from Greeks and vice versa. One of the things and he says these are Persian stories. They're not his own stories, or they're stories that he is recounting. But what's so useful for Persia in this is that, especially in his period, basically everything the Persian Empire is claiming coincides with the Greek idea of Asia, the Greek just geographical, the idea of the continent of Asia. So it's whether or not it's true that these are Persian stories, it's an extremely useful way of knitting together a Greek geographer's just kind of fairly neutral sort of scientific way of dividing the world with a Persian political way of dividing the world, which is to say that everything in Asia, including all the Greek-speaking cities in Asia, belongs to us. And everything beyond Asia we don't care about. So for me, what can look like cultural civilizational divides actually break down into a combination of more sort of neutral scientific description and very politicized ways of organizing the world, where, yes, to claim that a certain place belongs with other ones is something that you do to declare power over it.
We've mainly talked, even though this is not the intention of the book, we've mainly talked of the big stars of Carthage, Rome, Greece. Are there peoples or places that are less known to the general public that you would like to put forward and shed some light on? A lot of peoples are mentioned in the narrative. Is there somewhere or some people that you would like to talk about?
Absolutely. So I'm actually going to in the spirit of the book, I'm going to resist the temptation to talk about any particular place or people, but I'll talk about things that move. So there's one of the things that a lot of Europeans know about the Middle Ages is the stories from 1001 Nights. The Arabian Nights stories, those wonderful kind of fairy stories, fables. They only arrive in Europe in the 18th century. In fact, some of them are made up in the 18th century. But there's several earlier versions of these stories, these groups of stories that move around the whole world. So there's one I talk about in the book called Kalila and Dimna, which is a set of Indian animal stories, animal fables. Kalila and Dimna, two jackals who work for a lion king, that move from India to Persia to Baghdad at a time when the Arabs are translating a huge amount of Persian and Indian work as well as Greek work. And then they move from there into European languages from several different directions, become extremely well known in medieval Europe. So these stories turn up in Chaucer, in Boccaccio and so on. Some of them reach Norse sagas. So it's this, and they get changed slightly along the way. People don't just copy what they receive. And this is a really important part of what I talk about in the book, that nobody takes something from elsewhere and just repeats it. They always do something new with it. And so I love the way that in Kalila and Dimna, you start off with stories about advisors to Indian kings. In later versions, the person telling the stories becomes an ascetic, becomes a Muslim, the story changes according to what makes sense. Sometimes the genders involved in the story will swap because it makes more cultural sense where they arrive. So you have those kinds of things. There are other ones, Balaam and Josaphat, which comes into Christian Europe as a story about a resilient young Christian who sticks to his faith above all, but actually comes out of originally Indian stories about the Buddha. And just sort of changes, again, religion changes the story as it goes, but the stories themselves remain very similar. They go in the other direction, stories about Alexander the Great that are written probably in Egypt, but go into Iraq, Iran, and so on. They make Alexander the son of a pharaoh, they make him a Muslim, those kinds of things. These were completely new to me. Not 1001 Nights, but that there was a whole long set of stories before that, almost all of which came into Europe through the Islamic tradition. That was the crucial transmission of them. So yeah, that's. I'll leave it there. There are lots of things like that.
And people can find out for themselves in the book.
Yeah.
The book has just been translated in French. It's your second book translated in French, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. What's the significance for you of being translated in French? Are there French scholars of antiquity that you've enjoyed? What can you say about that?
Well, that's actually a very nice way of putting it. It's always just an immense honour for any, I think, English-speaking historian to be translated into French. That really suggests that there is an intellectual value to the work that very, very few other places offer that kind of validation. So that's one thing. It's very kind of, selfish joy to take in it. But more seriously, no, I mean, a lot of the work in this book is inspired by French scholarship and French scholars. And I'll just pick out one person because I think she lies behind a lot of both of my books that have been translated into French, which is the historian Corinne Bonnet, who taught in Toulouse for a long time. She's recently moved to a chair in ancient history at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa, which is it's probably the most prestigious ancient history position in Europe. And she's an extraordinary scholar of the Greek world, but even more of the Phoenician-speaking world. And it's a very imaginative, brilliant interpreter of texts. And also, and this is so important within academia, a really kind and good person. and so, I mean, I could talk about a lot of people, but I'll say that she's really somebody. She's actually Belgian herself. She's somebody who has been inspiring in many different ways to me as a scholar, and it makes it particularly pleasing to have my work in her primary scholarly language.
Thank you very much.
Merci de nous avoir écoutés. Rendez-vous sur le site www.paroledhistoire.fr pour toutes les informations sur le podcast, pour vous abonner, écouter ou télécharger les autres émissions. La discussion se poursuit aussi en ligne, notamment sur Twitter. Vous pouvez poser des questions @paroledist et à bientôt pour un prochain épisode.